I'm Susan Gleason, root cause dietitian with a certification in gastrointestinal nutrition. So over the course of the next week, I want to show you the process that I use for making sourdough einkorn bread. Because it takes a while to make sourdough, I can't do this all in one video, so I'm just going to shoot several small videos each time I do another step in the process, and hopefully we will turn out with a really nice loaf at the end of the week. But today, why sourdough and why einkorn? And I'm also going to tell you about a little twist that I do. So if eating regular bread or gluten just doesn't work for you, maybe you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or maybe that hasn't been diagnosed, but you get a headache or a skin rash or digestive issues or irritability or brain fog, fatigue, any number of symptoms when you eat gluten or bread, then you're going to want to listen up. So first of all, why einkorn, and what is it to begin with? So einkorn is probably the oldest of the wheat varieties that they have found so far. So they believe it was first cultivated 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. I know that's a huge range of time to pin it down to, but the difference between einkorn and modern wheat is that einkorn is a diploid, meaning it has 2 sets of chromosomes, whereas modern wheat is a hexaploid, meaning it has 6 sets of chromosomes. And this is all due to just changing the wheat as we have made it more fuller of gluten, and also just the way that we like bread in the modern day. But einkorn is thought to have originated in the upper area of the Fertile Crescent of the Near East. So they think like in the Tigris-Euphrates regions, and it was most likely the main grain recorded in earliest biblical history. Then it became widely distributed throughout the Near East and the Mediterranean region, southwestern Europe, and the Balkans, and was one of the first cereals cultivated for food. So einkorn has more nutrition than our modern wheat. So one thing in einkorn in a higher quantity is an antioxidant, a very powerful antioxidant called gluten, which is best known for enhancing eye health, but it's also really good for your skin, your brain, and your cardiovascular system. It's also a really good or a higher source of tocotrienols and tocopherols, which are 2 different forms of vitamin E, which is also a very powerful antioxidant. So, and compared to modern wheat, einkorn has higher levels of protein, fat, phosphorus, and potassium. So, because einkorn has a diploid, not a hexaploid, it has been wondered if there is less gluten content and therefore less what they call gluten toxicity. So they did a study in 2006, and this was reported in 2006 in the Scandinavian Journal of Gastroenterology. And so what they wanted to do was to figure out if what einkorn did versus wheat on the small intestinal mucosa. So this whole study was done in test tubes, not in animals or humans. So keep that in mind. This is a test tube study. So what they did, they biopsied 12 people with celiac disease, and they called these treated celiac patients, meaning that their celiac was under control, and then 17 people without celiac disease. And so then they took these biopsy tissues, put them all in a bunch of test tubes, and cultured them for 24 hours with wheat or with einkorn. And then for a control, they just cultured it with the medium. So anyway, after 24 hours, they examined the biopsy tissue under the microscope and also did some different types of immune system markers to see what the differences were. So what they found, significant changes in the structure of the biopsies if it was cultured with wheat, and that's of the intestinal tissue there, but not big changes with einkorn. Also, there were big changes in the markers of immune function with the wheat, but not with their einkorn. So their conclusion was, and then for the cultures done on people who did not have celiac disease, there was no change. So I need to note that as well. So anyway, their conclusion was that there was a lack of toxicity of einkorn gliadin, which is the way you kind of measure what it's going to do to you in the test tube, suggesting that there were new dietary opportunities for celiac patients. That was 2006. As far as I know, I have not heard of any newer studies. But then they also said that while the gluten ratio is much lower, the gluten and the ratio is much lower with the einkorn than wheat, that if you have celiac disease, they still don't recommend that you consume einkorn because it does contain gluten. However, if you have just trouble with wheat or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that it could be an option for you. And so then, why ferment the einkorn? So, fermentation, not only is it better for your gut because of prebiotics and probiotics formed when you ferment something, but the process of fermentation helps to break down that protein in wheat or einkorn, which is called gluten. So by helping to break it down, it makes it more digestible. So they even found that, the fermentation process of sourdough products alters the enzymes in the wheat. So all of these studies are on wheat, not einkorn, but it applies to einkorn as well. And it can help counteract adverse reactions to gluten. And then the other things about fermenting grains or sourdough is that they found that it has higher antioxidant capacity, the nutrients are better absorbed, it's more lowering of blood pressure, anti-diabetic, and it reduces FODMAP qualities of the wheat. And then one more thing that fermentation or sourdough and bread does is that it helps to keep the blood sugar in a tighter range. So when you consume a carbohydrate, then your blood sugar is going to go up and then back down. Now, consuming a carbohydrate with a fat or a protein is going to help slow that process, but it's still going to happen. However, when you sourdough a grain, and in this case they're talking about just like refined wheat or white wheat, it lowered the glycemic index as well as the glycemic load. And so then if you have whole grain wheat or whole grain einkorn versus the white, then it's going to have more fiber, which is going to mean even less strain on your blood glucose levels. And so that is why I started using sourdough einkorn, and it has worked for me very well. I do not have celiac disease. I do have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, tested through like a private little test, not diagnosed by a doctor, but I can definitely tell that I don't have any adverse reactions when I eat einkorn sourdough bread. So then a little twist that I do when I make my bread, and this is because that after making loaves and loaves and loaves of einkorn bread, I was wondering, because einkorn is a little pricey, so I was wondering what could I do to help reduce the cost, and I thought of rye. So rye is a gluten-containing grain, but it has about a third of the gluten content of wheat, so much, much lower in gluten content. So what I do, and I will show you this in the next video when I show you how I feed my starter. So I feed my starter the rye flour, so it's whole grain rye flour, and I also ferment it or feed it for a long time, a longer period of time than most people do. Like a week or two. I use about a quart of starter when I make a loaf of bread versus like a quarter to half a cup as is conventional. And by doing that, the rye has even longer to ferment, so that means even longer for the sourdough process to break down the gluten in the rye bread. So in the next segment or next video, I will show you my starter and how I feed it, and we will go from there and hopefully have a nice loaf of einkorn bread at the end.